Few could have imagined that the deepest and most mysterious truths about death would be uncovered not by scientists, not by priests, but by ordinary nurses. Behind the quiet doors of hospice rooms, things happen that medicine still cannot explain. People on the edge of life begin to speak in strange phrases, describing visitors no one else can see, or calling out names of loved ones who passed away long ago. They talk about journeys, light, voices, and home, often with a calmness that feels otherworldly. And while most turned away or dismissed these moments, Maggie Callanan and Patricia Kelley did something different. They listened, carefully, repeatedly, and they wrote it all down. What they discovered, documented over years of hospice work, may forever change the way we understand what happens in the final moments of life. Because sometimes, the dying are not just letting go. They're already starting to see what comes next. For decades, Maggie Callanan and Patricia Kelley served on the front lines of hospice care. They weren't famous, they weren't seeking attention, they were simply doing their jobs. But their jobs brought them closer to death than most of us ever come. Day after day, year after year, they sat at the bedsides of the dying. They held hands, they listened, and what they heard, what they consistently witnessed, changed everything. Through their shared experience, they began to notice a pattern. The patients they cared for often said things that seemed strange at first, sometimes even nonsensical. But the more they listened, the more they realized that these weren't random utterances. They were messages, symbols, warnings, reassurances. And they weren't rare. In fact, these types of experiences were happening again and again, across all kinds of patients, young and old, religious and atheist, coherent and barely conscious. Callanan and Kelley named this phenomenon nearing death awareness, NDA, a term that has since become a cornerstone in hospice literature. NDA describes a unique state of awareness some individuals enter as they approach the end of life. Patients begin to behave as though they're already partially in another place, able to perceive things the living cannot. And their words reflect that. In their groundbreaking book, Final Gifts, Understanding the Special Awareness, Needs, and Communications of the Dying, they documented dozens of these moments. The stories they shared were deeply human, deeply emotional, and remarkably similar. Patients would say things like, "I'm getting on the train soon. My mother is already waiting for me. They've come to help me go." To a casual observer, these phrases might seem like confusion or symptoms of medication. But Callanan and Kelley saw something deeper. These statements were often made by patients who were fully lucid, people who had otherwise shown no signs of delirium or cognitive decline. And in nearly every case, these statements preceded death by just hours or days. What the nurses discovered wasn't just a collection of emotional anecdotes, it was a repeating spiritual pattern. People approaching death weren't fading into nothingness. They were describing a transition, a movement, a journey, and many of them spoke of being accompanied by loved ones who had already passed. In fact, some patients would appear to hold conversations with unseen visitors. They would look to the corners of their rooms, their faces calm, sometimes joyful. They would nod, smile, whisper. These were not signs of distress. They were moments of deep presence and peace. Some even asked family members, "Don't you see him?" referring to someone who wasn't physically there. Callanan and Kelley believed that these experiences were not hallucinations. They were part of an unspoken language of the dying, a kind of communication that reached beyond the rational mind towards something greater, something beyond the veil. Their work brought clarity and comfort to thousands of families. By helping caregivers and loved ones understand what the dying were expressing, they removed fear. They helped people stop trying to correct the dying or silence them, and instead taught them to listen. So what did Maggie and Patricia truly learn after sitting beside hundreds, perhaps thousands of people in their final hours? They learned that death is rarely silent. It speaks in symbols and metaphors. It reaches through memory and meaning. And for those willing to hear it, the message is always the same. You are not alone. Someone is already waiting. As death draws near, something strange begins to happen. Something that Maggie Callanan and Patricia Kelley saw too many times to dismiss as coincidence. Patients begin to speak differently. Their language shifts into metaphor. Their thoughts turn to journeys, gatherings, and visitors. and slowly, a quiet but profound transformation takes place. Many begin to talk about travel, not metaphorically, but as if they are about to depart for a real destination. They speak of trains, boats, or roads. A man in his 80s once whispered, "I need to pack. They told me the bus is coming." When asked who told him, he simply smiled and said, "You wouldn't understand." Some patients describe arriving at places that don't physically exist. Living rooms with soft couches, gardens, sunlit porches, or bridges stretching into the distance. One woman, hours before her death, kept asking the nurse to open the door, even though the room had no door where she was pointing. And then there are the visitors. Patients often begin to speak to people no one else in the room can see. They call them by name, Mom, Frank, my baby girl, and the warmth in their voice is unmistakable. They'll reach out toward empty corners of the room or say things like, "He's standing right there. Don't you see him?" The experience is usually peaceful, even joyful. It's not just adults. Children, too, exhibit these patterns. Some start playing with unseen friends. Others laugh at invisible jokes, or look just past the adults in the room and say things like, "That man wants me to come play now." These experiences often share recurring images, symbols that appear again and again, doors opening or closing, bright light coming from unknown sources, water or rivers to be crossed, bridges stretching into a golden mist, trains, boats, or cars ready to take them home. What's most striking is the calm that accompanies these moments. Patients who were once restless or fearful often become serene, even radiant, as if in some way they now understand something we don't. It's as though they've glimpsed something waiting for them, and they're no longer afraid to go. Maggie and Patricia began documenting these patterns carefully, and over time, the consistency of these images, across thousands of unrelated patients, became impossible to ignore. It didn't matter if someone was religious or atheist, young or old, educated or not. The same kinds of images appeared, the same sense of preparation, the same peace. And no, these were not hallucinations. In most cases, the patients were fully alert. They had normal vital signs. They recognized family members. They could carry on conversations. But their attention was also, unmistakably, elsewhere, as though part of them had already begun the journey. To the outsider, these moments might sound poetic, but to the people experiencing them, and to the nurses who witnessed them, they were real, tangible, repetitive, and often transformative. As Patricia Kelley once said, "When you hear the same story from people who don't know each other, who are dying in different places, from different backgrounds, at some point, you have to ask, what if they're seeing something real?" And that question, quietly but persistently, echoes through every hospice room where a patient begins to say, "They've come, I'm ready." Some stories are so powerful, so precise, that even the most hardened skeptic would struggle to dismiss them. Maggie Callanan and Patricia Kelley encountered many such cases, moments that left families stunned, but which, to the nurses, had become strangely familiar. One of the most striking stories was that of an elderly woman who, weeks before her death, calmly announced the exact date she would pass. Not as a guess or a fearful prediction, she said it with clarity and certainty. Her family was puzzled, even skeptical, but as the date approached, her health began to decline. On the morning she had named, she woke up, smiled, and whispered, "It's today." She died that evening, just as she had said. Then there was the man who, seemingly out of nowhere, sat up in bed and said, "They're already here, I can hear their footsteps." He looked toward the corner of the room and nodded as if greeting someone. Within 10 minutes, he took his final breath. His family, shaken, asked the nurses what had just happened. But Maggie and Patricia had seen it before. This wasn't unusual. This was part of the process. Another patient, a woman in her 70s, had lost her only daughter decades earlier. She rarely spoke about the loss, and even less so as she grew closer to the end. But in her final hours, she became animated, eyes wide, voice soft but joyful. "She's here," she said, her face glowing. "She looks just the same." For the next few minutes, she carried on a conversation with someone no one else could see, laughing, smiling, even saying, "I've missed you so much." Her family sat in stunned silence. To them, it was inexplicable. But the nurses had seen this kind of reunion before, again and again. There was also the story of a man who had told the staff that every night someone came to visit him. a figure dressed in white who never spoke but simply sat beside him in the dark. The man wasn't afraid. In fact, he seemed comforted by the visits. "He's not here to take me yet," he said once, "but he's checking on me." The night he passed, he didn't mention the figure, but he looked toward the chair by his bed, smiled softly, and closed his eyes. These stories aren't from Hollywood scripts. They aren't dramatized for effect. They are real accounts, shared by patients and observed by medical professionals, recorded with compassion, curiosity, and care. The details differ slightly, but the essence is the same. As death nears, something or someone comes close. The families who witness these moments are often left speechless. Their first reaction is confusion, then wonder, sometimes fear. But for Maggie and Patricia, these scenes were not cause for alarm. They were, in a way, reassurances, signs that the person was not alone in their final moments. "It always surprises the family," Maggie once said in an interview, "but it never more. We've learned that these moments are not rare, they're part of the pattern." The nurses never claimed to know exactly what their patients were seeing. They didn't offer theories, and they didn't preach. But they paid attention, and they documented everything. And from those observations, one thing became clear. The dying aren't slipping into nothingness. They are preparing for something. Something that, at least to them, feels very real. These are the kinds of moments that stay with you forever. Not because they're dramatic, but because they feel like the quiet whisper of a truth the world is too busy to hear. As Maggie Callanan and Patricia Kelley spent years at the bedsides of those nearing death, they began to see a deeper pattern, something more than strange phrases and fleeting visions. They realized the dying weren't just reacting to something. They were communicating. And not just with their loved ones or caregivers, but perhaps with something or someone on the other side. Their words often changed in the final days. Not chaotic, not delusional, but symbolic, poetic, as if the language we use every day was no longer enough to describe what they were experiencing. A patient wouldn't say, "I'm dying." Instead, they'd whisper, "I'm going home," or "My bags are packed," or "They're here to take me." Another patient, calm and peaceful, told her nurse, "The light is so beautiful. I wish you could see it too." At first glance, these may sound like metaphors, but when you hear the same kinds of phrases, again and again, across different hospitals, different ages, different beliefs, they begin to sound like messages. And Maggie and Patricia began to believe that these messages were meant for the living. What are the dying trying to say? According to Maggie and Patricia, one central message came through, again and again. They are not alone, and neither are we. Many patients described being accompanied by loved ones who had passed, or by peaceful presences they couldn't fully describe. They spoke with clarity, with warmth. They weren't scared. They were ready. Their language shifted toward peace, toward reunion, toward relief. "I'm almost there. It doesn't hurt anymore. They're calling my name." These were not cries of pain or fear. They were often the last coherent words patients spoke, and they carried a remarkable emotional weight. Maggie and Patricia emphasized that these weren't just comforting ideas. They were observable patterns, expressed by people who were fully lucid, unmedicated, and deeply present. In those moments, the veil between life and whatever comes after seemed thin. And the dying, whether they were ready or not, seemed to see through it. What the nurses discovered was that when families and caregivers learned to listen to these messages, something profound happened. Fear gave way to peace. Confusion turned into understanding. The strange metaphors weren't something to correct. They were something to embrace. By accepting that the dying may be experiencing something beyond our reach, loved ones were able to feel more connected. Not just to the person they were losing, but to something bigger. To the journey itself. Maggie and Patricia believed that death wasn't a sudden cutoff, a disappearance, or a void. It was a transition. And like any transition, it had signs, if only we knew how to recognize them. They taught that listening without judgment, allowing the dying to speak in their own language, no matter how strange it may sound, was one of the greatest gifts we could offer. Because in the end, what the dying may be telling us is not about endings at all. It's about arrival, about going somewhere, being met, being held. And when we start listening, not just with our ears but with our hearts, we realize that these messages aren't just for those about to leave. they're also for those left behind. Thanks to people like Maggie, Callanan, and Patricia, Kelley, we have a rare chance to see death not as a terrifying end, but as the beginning of something else. Something we may not fully understand, but that feels deeply familiar. They didn't invent these stories. They didn't dramatize them. They observed, listened, and documented what so many others overlooked. Their work became a quiet bridge between two worlds, between what we know and what may come next. And because of them, we are no longer left in total darkness. We can begin to trust that when the time comes, when our bodies release us, we won't be alone. Someone will already be waiting. And maybe, just maybe, there is more to come than we ever imagined. Do you believe in life after death? Write in the comments. Recently, some interesting videos were released on my channel. I strongly advise you to watch them. Please don't forget to like this video if you liked it. See you soon.